You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
So at this time, I would like to welcome the distinguished members of our second panel, the subject of which is mobilizing technology, new and old. And we've heard a lot about technology already today, and it's quite clear that technology, the issues around it, are going to be a preeminent question for foreign policy community writ large and for the next administration. Our panel will be moderated by Ambassador Adrian Zuckerman. Oh, no, you can wait right here. Sorry. Ambassador Zuckerman is currently of counsel at DLA Piper. He advises corporations on legal, regulatory, and governmental affairs. From 2019 to 2021, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Romania, where he oversaw the negotiations that led to the signing of a 10-year defense cooperation agreement with the United States. And he is eminently qualified to moderate our next panel on technologies, new and old. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. Welcome.
Yeah, well. Hello, Karen. I don't know. Oh, there you are. Before we start, I want to thank Karen for joining us. She's on the West Coast. She's been severely impacted by the fires out there, so our thoughts and prayers are with you, your family, and all the other people struggling through that horrible condition out there. So thank you for joining us today, Karen. I also want to thank Ambassador Moose and Corinne Graff and your staff. What an amazing job you guys have done today. Fabulous. Thank you so much for letting us participate. Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to welcome you to today's panel discussion on leveraging technology, old and new. As advancements in technology reshape our world, their implications for national security, economic strategy, and global stability have become increasingly critical. Today, we'll explore how the United States and its allies can adapt to and harness these changes to address the complex challenges of the 21st century. We are fortunate to have an esteemed panel of experts with us. Jim Carafano, Senior Counselor to the President and E.W. Richardson Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, who has done extensive work on national security and cyber policy. Tarun Chhabra, Deputy Assistant to the President and Coordinator for Technology and National Security at the National Security Council, who brings a deep understanding of how the current administration has been approaching these critical issues. Thank you. Tino, Cuéllar, President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, whose expertise spans international law, innovation, and governance. And lastly, joining us online from Malibu, we have Dr. Karen Skinner, a distinguished scholar from Pepperdine University, whose research on national security and foreign policy informs our understanding of the global technological landscape. Thank you all for being with us. Let's start in the following fashion. We'll address a range of topics this afternoon, but to start us off, I'd like to ask each of you what you see as the most pressing technological challenges that demand urgent attention from national security officials today, and why. Jim, let's start with you, and then we'll work our way down the line. That's what happens where you're next to me.
The first thing I want to say is, I know this is supposed to be like this precious, nonpartisan, bipartisan moment, which I think is awesome, but usually I'm much more comfortable being on the far right, so my seat's good, sir. Okay.
It's not often that I get on the right of you.
I do want to say, while I have the phone, is this guy is one of the great public selfless service for the American people. He was a fantastic ambassador. He continues to do great service really across the world on behalf of the United States. So thank you for your service and all you do. Really, I think that we should. It's just fantastic. So, we tend to always want to talk about change as we go from one administration to another. I also think it's important to talk about continuity. And I think it's particularly important, this panel is particularly important because I think one of the things that has become mainstream to the conversation about technology is it's not about the technology. When we say let's have a conversation about technology, it always becomes like our electrons versus their electrons. But the reality is one of the emerging and important dynamics that we have seen develop in the last couple of years is the threats to the physical infrastructure that carries the technology. And we talk about these things as these are kind of two separate conversations. And we're not making the mental connectivity between building a cable and then somebody physically ripping up that cable that's carrying the digital infrastructure. We have already seen, not just kind of freaking out about drones, but we've already seen people that actually had physical plans and intent to use drones to attack the infrastructure. So I think this has been a growing trend where we've seen both the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, and the Biden administration increasingly recognizing the importance of having these two conversations overlapping. And I hope that trend only continues to accelerate. It's not just about protecting digital infrastructure and energy infrastructure, but it's increasingly about the infrastructure that's in outer space. And I think these are the really big issues because they are the heartbeat of the world. The physical infrastructure of energy, the digital connectivity, and our dependence on space. And defending those physical, the infrastructure behind those technologies, even as we develop technology, are, I think, in many ways, the pacing issue that we're going to see in the years ahead. So I think that's why this discussion today is really particularly important.
Thank you. Tarun?
Thanks very much, Adrian, for hosting us today. And thanks to the USIP and other think tanks for collaborating on this event. So I'd put a few things on the table where I think there is actually a lot of agreement. We've built on policies that began during the Trump administration, and I think there's scope for the new team to do that as well. The first area is artificial intelligence. So, right now the debate between the leaders of our top AI labs in the United States is when, not whether, we are going to see capabilities that rival or exceed that of the most capable humans in all kinds of disciplines, whether we're talking about electrical engineering or biology. And the national security and economic consequences are really just hard to fathom. But what we've tried to do is a few things. One is to ensure that the national security community, the intelligence community, the Defense Department are prepared and able to take advantage of those frontier capabilities faster than our adversaries. Number two is to make sure, and this is an executive order that was just launched today, make sure that we are able to accelerate the power and permitting so we can do the build out of frontier AI infrastructure here in the United States. And then number three is to have a much more systematic approach to continuing our policy of preventing China from accessing the leading edge hardware that they would need to compete and pose national security risks to us and our allies, but also ensure that American AI can diffuse around the world in a safe and responsible way, including with respect to our allies. So that's something where I think there's a lot of room for agreement. That will require adjustments in many cases on the part of our industry, and you're seeing I think a healthy debate on that right now, but I think there's a lot of scope for us to work together because it will be in the next administration, I believe, that we'll see the emergence of those kinds of capabilities. The second area has to do with really the nexus that Jim just talked about, and that's the nexus between our critical infrastructure and the world of the Internet of Things, where all devices are connected. And that's why we have built actually on authorities we inherited from the Trump administration, Commerce Department authorities, to secure what we call information communication, telecommunications technologies. Just today we finalized a rule on connected vehicles, which will really prohibit Chinese connected vehicles from coming to the United States and associated hardware as well, because of the concern that those vehicles are going to be deeply connected to cars around them, our infrastructure around them. It would be yet another vector to see the kinds of activity that we identified as Volt Typhoon. And I think you'll see similar work on drones, you'll see similar work on cloud. Again, there's a lot of continuity there. And the third is in biotechnology. And that's where the nexus between AI and advanced biotechnology, sometimes called bioconvergence, really has the potential to revolutionize supply chains and manufacturing, let alone, obviously, health applications, but also defense, if you think about what it could do for anything from advanced materials to human-brain interface technologies to energetics. And that's an area where I worry we're really not investing enough. China is investing a lot in that space. And I hope that the National Security Commission on Biotechnology, which is actually going to be presenting its report probably in the next month or so, can develop a bipartisan consensus to put us on a more competitive path in that space.
Thank you very much. Tino?
Ambassador, thank you. And I want to just point out that it's a delight to be on this panel. Thank you to the U.S. Institute of Peace and all its partners. And Tarun, great to see you. And Jim, I don't know if you remember this, but in 2008, you and I were on a panel very much like this. You look exactly the same. I feel a lot older, probably look a lot older too.
I had no hair then.
Yeah.
I have no hair now. Thank you.
As you said, consistency and change. I want to pick up a little bit on Tarun's point about biotech to make a larger point about the two things I think are most important for the U.S. with respect to technology and national security. The bio sector has been very critical to getting the U.S. and the world to be much more prosperous over time. I'm thinking about the Green Revolution, advances in public health, vaccines even, environmental science, pollution control, and all that. We have far longer life expectancies. We have greater wealth, greater time, more time with our loved ones before they die. All of that ought to send a powerful lesson to the whole world, and certainly to Americans, which is that the technology sector is foundational to our welfare and our well-being. But it's also foundational to our national security. So if I think about the two critical things for the U.S. over the next 4 years, 8 years, or longer around technology, one is simply to maintain the edge and to continue to be the best as much as possible on the tech frontier. So whether we're talking synthetic bio or biotech more generally, generative AI, other kinds of machine learning, quantum, the delicate ecosystem of universities, public money, private money, innovation through startups, diffusion of knowledge, government partnerships, critical contracts from the defense sector sometimes, all of that working together needs to be sort of respected and supported in some way. And I would note in particular, the attraction of applied research is an understandable thing. We want things to be turned into practical applications. But too much of an allure of that can drain the sector of basic research dollars that are also super, super critical. So one is making sure that on every lever we have, whether it's making sure there's room for startups, making sure we don't overregulate the sector, making sure there are public dollars that flow into basic research, we keep that innovation system going. Second, though, is recognizing that if we're going to apply any technology, it could be synthetic bio or generative AI effectively, we have to get away from the idea that fast deployment is somehow anathema to taking some care to making sure that there isn't some danger associated with it, or that we're not learning at the same time. So I'm for running fast and hard, but making sure in the process we do plenty of testing and understanding what's not going well, and we can iterate and make it better.
Thank you, Tino. Karen, we're ready for you. You've been patiently waiting. I'll say up there because you're above my head here. So,
well,
please.
Let me begin by thanking you, Ambassador Zuckerman, for your friendship and for supporting me during the second or third evacuation that I've experienced. There's been so many since early December, but it's good to know that we have a country that cares, and there's a lot of finger pointing here in Los Angeles, but I've seen people come together and work together in ways that defy the political divide in Washington. So that's a good part of this. I'd also like to thank Ambassador George Moose, whom I have admired for many decades and had such a distinguished career at the State Department, encouraged numerous generations of African Americans and others to pursue diplomacy. And his partner, the Chief of Strategy and Research, Corin Graff, they've done an amazing job in bringing us all together very quickly. The question you put to us is an important one, and I would say that our single biggest national security threat also affects technology, and in my view, it is K through 16 and how we're educating young people. And I say K through 16 and not K through 12 because universities have a stake in the problem as well. We actually need to get back to the 3 R's and more STEM education and more STEAM education. I think that would allow for Americans to be more competitive at the graduate level. It would address this growing debate among on the MAGA side and the Democratic Party about the H-1B visa. We do need more Americans at the tip of the spear in technology. But if you look at our educational system, it is not what it was 50 years ago. And I do think that the introduction of lots of disciplines and subfields that don't go to basics of the 3 R's have a lot to do with where we are right now. So I'm not making the case that certain disciplines in the humanities should go away. I'm not arguing, as some in the MAGA world do, that our educational system is completely woke, but I do think we need to reposition it. Tino and I are both professors at major universities, and we've been in this space for a very long time. There's a lot of opportunity for improvement. And I would say also, we have not found a way to fully address the digital divide at home. And so I've been thinking a lot about that in the past few days because I'm digitally challenged right now. And I could go off screen in any minute. It's hard to get internet. It almost feels like many of us have been taken back to the beginning of the earth as our neighborhoods have burned to the ground. And you think about people in the urban communities and the talent of young people, but they don't even have internet access. They don't have a laptop. They don't have courses or schools that have labs where they can begin scientific inquiry early. That shows up in our competition with China. And it's very critical that we bring our innovation and creativity in the American public back. No one can beat us in the world when you unleash us in terms of creativity. And that's one of the reasons I don't worry about the Chinese so much. They don't have a lock on the creative spirit the way that the American does because of our history and other factors as well. There are many other points that I could make, but these are important ones. I did want to respond a little bit to Tino's comments. I believe that the ecosystem of the university, of the private sector, which spins out startups, and government is what produced the great American economy post-1945 that got us a man on the moon, that led to the base technologies for stealth weapons with some anti-Vietnam postdoc in a lab with long hair doing cool science. But I think we've gotten away from it, and we are now leaning more toward startups in the private sector and the role of the university and government. And I don't think in the long run that helps our technological development or our national security, because there's something about having the university and the government together owning the problem. Private sector, important, but it doesn't see the problem in terms of national security, in terms of some of the bigger societal issues. that happen inside the university when it's working well and when the government like DARPA is working well.
Thank you, Karen. I want to come back to some of the issues that have just been raised, but first let me turn to an issue that's been on my mind and I've been dealing with recently. As some of you may have heard, there have been a variety of hybrid and cyber attacks in Europe. There have been over 30 this past year, and recently in Romania there was a massive cyber attack by the Russians attacking the Romanian electoral process with help from the Chinese through a variety of manipulations in the algorithms on TikTok. And my thinking here is, well, that resulted in the annulment of the first round of the Romanian presidential elections. So my thinking here is, what are the most critical steps that governments and our international partners should take to strengthen their cyber defenses, deter future attacks that target not just U.S. national security, but our allies' national security? And especially, what should we be doing here in the U.S.? Tarun, do you want to, since you're the official national security guy, you want to take your first crack at this?
So yeah, with the big caveat that you'd be better off talking with my colleague Ann Neuberger, who covers cyber at the NSC. I think there actually has been a lot of work going on, as you know, on trying to raise the bar for what cyber standards are across industry, and probably even a little bit more work on that forthcoming this week. One of the things that she's worked on very hard with industry is actually, for example, to set standards for the Internet of Things so that we have kind of agreed standards across industry, especially as everything becomes more and more connected. This is also a topic that I know Jake can speak to next, because he's been having some conversations with the incoming National Security Advisor as well about what is and isn't working in cyberspace. I do think we've made some headway overall when we talk about digital infrastructure and who should be providing digital infrastructure, and when we talk about who should be providing AI infrastructure to not just our closest allies around the world, but also countries that are really looking at China and the United States and seeing what's on offer. I think the cyber activities over the last 4 years in particular have really made clear what the risks are in a way that maybe wasn't so clear just 4 years ago. So there's progress there, but where we do continue to struggle is on the resources side, where services and infrastructure is offered almost for free. That is a huge challenge that we're going to continue to face. One of the things we can do is to try to work with countries like India that can offer competitive prices, not just in India, but throughout the developing world for services like telecom to compete more effectively. And that is something where I think there's a lot more room for progress.
I would just add, I agree with everything Tarun said. To my mind, there's a piece that has to be about standards. Ultimately, a whole bunch of organizations that introduce real vulnerabilities into critical infrastructure, which Jim talked about as well, whether it's elections or electric power generation, to either don't have the standard they should or are not effective at implementing it. And even very basic things like routine use of two-factor authentication or very broad nets of education and training and monitoring of their employees. But beyond that, I would say a major challenge in the cyber domain is attribution. It's not the only one, but I would note at Carnegie we've done some work with other countries, including the Chinese, on where can we come together to improve our ability to attribute cyber attacks so that we don't have a situation where third parties, either countries that have strategic interest in doing so or non-state actors, can game the system by getting the US and some other country into some country and they really shouldn't. And then the third would be a kind of strategic vision. I suspect that not just from a legal perspective, but actually from a fact-specific strategic judgment call context, one of the hardest choices is how to respond to a cyber attack that you can attribute, where you don't want to escalate and end up in a kinetic situation. But too much restraint can be a real risk, to my mind. So I would just note that.
Before I let you jump in, Jim, I just want to make one point. The unusual fact about the most recent Romania attack is the massive scale of the attack, and also that it was a plan which I understand was put in place for many years by the Russians, but it was implemented with help from the Chinese. And I'm not sure how many of those sort of collaborative efforts there are, because TikTok is implicated tremendously, changing algorithms and all kinds of other things that they do. So that's one of the first major attacks of this kind that I'm aware of where they collaborated. So,
yeah, I want to go back to the point I made about the importance of merging the defense of physical infrastructure and technology policy together. And I think two lessons from 9/11. The first is post 9/11, we made a lot of advances in thinking about the physical protection of infrastructure, and it was almost exclusively with non-state actors, right? Because we never thought that a state would dare to come after our infrastructure. So we now know that that's completely not true, and that we have to be fully prepared to deal in both of these spaces. And even though means, motive, and opportunity for both might be different, and you have to address them differently, the reality is you've got to put weight on both of those. So I think that's one. The second one is prioritization, right? So you cannot defend everything everywhere all the time and be successful. And so there are things that, if you're going to have a real national security policy, that there have to be some things that are literally non-negotiable. And I do think there were three. One, we can survive almost everything, but not if there's no electricity. So America, this has to be non-negotiable. The notion of taking this nation offline on energy, that cannot happen, ever, period. I think we're similarly dependent on digital connectivity. The notion that that could be denied to us, simply unacceptable. And I think the third one is physical space. We need to own our skies to be protected against physical attack. And when we say skies these days, it doesn't stop at the air above us. It extends to cis space, which I don't even know what it is, right? And it has nothing to do with gender, right? But it's beyond, it's not just low Earth orbit, but it's the spaces beyond low Earth orbit which will support the critical physical space infrastructure that allows us to do space here on Earth. So what I would love to see from an incoming administration is say, we may get a lot of things wrong, but you can shoot us and fire us if we don't get these three things right. And I do have two other comments that I wanted to say because I think they're important. One is, oftentimes, again, a lesson learned from 9/11, and I think we continue to screw this up, is we say, we kind of think this is a very symmetrical ways. It's our electrons versus your electrons. We solve cyber problems with cyber defenses or cyber attacks. And the reality is we are not fighting against, we are fighting against actors, not against electrons. And so you have to have a complex response. Maybe the best way to deter attacks to your physical infrastructure or cyber things, or is just having good comprehensive policies. Doing biotechnology investments in places where you're creating more risks than you're solving problems. Don't let enemies do terrible things to your infrastructure or do politically aggressive activities and not make them pay a price for that. And the last one I want to get to is the most uncomfortable which is two things can be true at the same time. And I think Romania is a good example. What we saw in Romania was a deliberate attack about political interference by foreign actors trying to change an outcome, which was actually going to be not good for Romanians, not good for Europeans, not good for Americans. At the same time, the reason, I think if we're honest, why those attacks had fertile ground to plow in is because I think the mainstream Romanian political parties have failed the Romanian people. And whether voters didn't care if they were being sent messages by Russians or Chinese or whoever, they didn't like what they were being offered, and they wanted something different. And I think both those things are true simultaneously. We've got some poor governance, and we have enemies taking advantage of that. That problem's not going away anytime soon, and we have to recognize that those two things can be true at the same time, and we have to deal with them. And we also have to recognize that we live in a world in which politics is absolutely a part of the technology policy discussion. in fact, if you look at a lot of the response that people made to the Romanian example, it wasn't based on the evidence of what they saw. It was based on their politics. If they didn't trust governments or that's what they believed. So the reality is there is skepticism. I know you guys had to deal with this, right? About whether our government is taking legitimate actions. Whether our government is really overseeing our biomedical programs in a way that's in the interest of the American people. We can't pretend that all that's disinformation and not true, and that we don't have a serious obligation as we do these things to protect Americans and our friends and allies, that we also have an obligation to provide the level of transparency and confidence that we are actually doing these things in a credible, responsible way. And anybody that writes a technology or physical security problem and doesn't recognize that they have a trust deficit with Americans and also with many of their friends and allies, and they have to address that as well as the physical problems, they're never going to have successful policies.
Thank you. Karan, do you want to jump in quickly here?
Sure. I think this discussion motivated, Adrian, by your example in Europe, speaks to something that Donald Trump campaigned on in 2016 and was aggressive about during his first term, and has had a big impact since then. And that is NATO having its members live up to the Wells Pledge of 2% of GDP toward mutual defense. When I think about this conversation, it makes me confident that NATO will survive and probably thrive, because the coordination that comes from having mutual defense equally or close to equally paid for gives assurance that more money is going into R&D and the discovery of exotic technologies that can block a lot of the aggression that we're seeing between Russia and its attack on Ukraine right now. And it will make countries like Romania a lot safer. So I think technology bodes well for the future of NATO, which I know many of our Democratic friends are worried that Trump will try to remove the US from. So that's one point. Another one is someone talked about the attribution problem in the technology space. We're better off on attribution issues than we were a decade ago. But this takes me back to a comment made by Uganda's ambassador in the previous segment. We need all states on our side in the technology race. And if we're on the one side doing social engineering as a way to get foreign assistance, and then we will need that same country later or simultaneously in some kind of kinetic fight that includes technology that may exist in that country, or that country has been weakened by some of the things that we do, and in addition to their own governance issues, we create wayport states for bad behavior. And that makes the attribution problem all the more difficult. The weaker other countries are, the more technologists who want to harm us gravitate to that space to increase the likelihood that they won't be discovered. So I think there's a bigger conversation about all aspects of our policy. If we're serious about using technology for good, to block war, to stop conflict, than we've had in the past.
Thanks, Karen. And that's a good segue with regard to NATO, because President Trump was absolutely right 4 years ago, 8 years ago, I guess, because up until this year, only 9 countries of all the NATO members paid their 2% Wales pledge. And still today, 9 countries of all 32 current members still don't pay the 2%. And there's one country, which I mentioned to Carla earlier, doesn't even have any tanks. And I seem to recall the World War II movies with German tanks rolling through Holland, and they've got no tanks today because the current Secretary General of NATO, when he was Prime Minister of Holland, sold them all to the Finns. In terms of NATO and what its role should be, what should we do here? Should we invoke Article 4? Should Romania seek guidance and help from its NATO partners? We all know there are 5 areas of warfare: air, land, sea, space, and cyber. NATO, and I think most of the other world's democracies, are probably least prepared to deal with the cyber attacks, which we have seen over the last year, 2 years.
Well, look,
What should we do?
I'll just note, there has to be some space between invoking Article 4 and doing nothing, right? To my mind, the whole logic of deterrence being what it is, and also the stakes of getting all of NATO involved being what they are, one can't do nothing, but this is why some of what the US and its allies, NATO, will have to deal with over the next few years will be a set of tools, some used publicly, some not, that are effective at creating a real deterrent, a cost, either to the non-state actors who are involved or to the state actors. I would add something else, which is, it's probably useful here to bring back a little bit the longer term perspective. We have these incidents that occur that are very heavily technology focused and implicate a decision that has to be made to protect in the short term. But medium to long term, the real issue, to my mind, is will democracies, the US and its closest allies, retain a strong and unambiguous technological advantage on frontier technologies like generative AI? And given the widespread, not only dual use, but like pervasive usefulness of the technology, that's really where it's at some level. And that gets back to some of the issues that Kyron was bringing up a little while ago. And I should say here, I agree with you, Kyron, about universities. And I note that, to my mind, that innovation ecosystem does have to leverage the startups. But it is concerning to me that if I think about a story where democracies retain advantage, it will have to be by leveraging their strengths. And one of them is an effective science side to the higher ed sector. And frontier AI, as Tarun knows, is the first time in recent memory, really, where we've had that sector not really be anywhere near the frontier when it comes to actually figuring out how to take the technology that we have right now and take it a step above. That doesn't mean that what's happening in the university isn't relevant. It just means we have to think a little harder about how to make sure that stuff outside the corporate sector retains a really critical role in the system.
Can I just pull in, because the answer to your question is, alliances like NATO are successful when Article 4 or Article 5 is never the question. Exactly. If you're actually at the point where you're saying, we may have to pull Article 4 or Article 5 trigger, the alliance is failing. And I think the future is in national self-defense. And I think this is the lesson in Ukraine is countries that are more resilient and capable of defending themselves are much more likely not to be on the menu. And so having the capacity for self-defense, and as you pointed out, is there is no such thing as defense if you can operate in one domain, and because war and competition occurs in all the domains and they're all interrelated. And so maybe you don't have a navy because you're landlocked, but the reality is unless your maritime interests, your land interests, your air interests, and your cyber interests and your space interests are all protected, you're not actually having defense. I would say, to bring in your point, is access to the science and technology and defense industrial base, that is part of defense. The reason Israel is in the fight today is in large part because Israel has developed enormous capabilities internally to be able to demonstrate it can defend itself. Not every country is going to do that, but you either have to have that in your country or you have to have access to that. So it's about all the domains, but as you pointed out, it's about also having the R&D and technological base that supports the ability to operate in all that domains, and that's going to evolve and change over.
One quick
time.
footnote on that, if I could I agree, and I think that will bring us to some hard judgment calls, which we faced in the nuclear context, around how much to enable our allies to take on the technology we have and effectively own it.
Yeah, this actually is the real Ukraine issue, right? People say, what are the future security guarantees and blah, blah, blah. The only thing that's going to provide a free and safe Ukraine in the future is if Ukraine, in of NATO, out of NATO, in the EU, it doesn't matter. If it's the country can defend itself and its territory and its interests, then it's going to be an apple that Russia's not going to want to bite. And I think the lesson from that is everybody should want to be that.
Yeah, but part of the problem here, the reason I raise Article 4 of NATO, which is just a discussion amongst the member states with regard to these attacks as to how best to coordinate a response. And I'd like to go to Tarun to put you on the spot on this. Absent of that, it's my impression that none of these countries individually, like a Romania or like France, which has been attacked, the UK's been attacked, there have been hybrid and cyber attacks throughout Europe, from explosions to cyber attacks to all kinds of other kinetic acts. Can member states deal with it alone, or is it too much of an effort unless a coordinated NATO policy involving the US, involving all NATO members, is developed to push back? Because the two real adversaries here are in Europe, primarily Russia with Chinese help on the cyber end.
Yeah, look, I think
Yeah,
this,
so let me speak to that point. I think it's really critical, and it relates to what Jim Carafano said just a moment ago. Deterrence is really difficult. And deterrence actually is the exception, military deterrence, not the rule. And when you have European countries very close to each other that don't have the kind of economy and size and population and military power that the US has, or that Germany and some of the other members are blessed with, they've got to have support from the bigger members. And no matter how much they try to prepare themselves, they don't have the capacity to be credible in terms of deterrence. And when we look at world history, one of the best periods for deterrence was during the Cold War, and it was the presence of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons do have a deterrent effect. That's why nations want them. That's why North Korea has them. That's why other countries are contemplating them. And so I think we just have to really understand how hard deterrence is. I also think that we have to know more about, and this is not as much the case for Europe as it is for the global South, understand culture, people, history better, because that affects what they will accept in terms of deterrence. And so I think those kind of soft power issues are much more critical in the technology space, in the military strategy space, than often appears in our conversation. I don't know if this helps you, Adrian, but I think Romania needs a lot more support. That's what I come down to, come down on that side.
It helps Romania, it doesn't help me. Tarun, let's come back to you. You started
so, look, I think Karen's point is right. This raises a broader question about what can and can't be effectively and credibly deterrent in terms of cyber activity. At one end, there's kind of typical, there's espionage. At the other end, there's physical effects on our critical infrastructure, which Jim was referring to earlier, and where we're going to respond, how we're going to respond, and how we're going to respond in the context of an alliance. I think we can have a lot of debate about. Just to be very practical about this in the meantime, we should not be allowing new vectors of attack to come into allied countries. Right. So what's happening right now, you have a lot of allied countries that are allowing, potentially, if this goes unchecked, millions of vehicles that can collect data that could become vectors for sabotage, right, into their territories. The same thing with drones, potentially the same thing with cloud services, potentially the same things with advanced biotechnology equipment as well, in terms of thinking about data security that has real national security consequences. So, we have these discussions with the European Commission. We have some of them with our close allies, but maybe this is a conversation that needs to be had in the NATO context as well, because of the implications for critical infrastructure.
Can I just tie those two comments together? Because I take Karen's point that, look, let's be honest. If North Macedonia gets to 5% of GDP, that means that North Macedonia will field maybe 3 trucks instead of 1. Okay, but the reality is the more a partner demonstrates the willingness and capacity for self-defense. To be the heart, like the story about the two guys being chased by the bear. You know, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you. The more you demonstrate that you are a harder nut to crack and convince people that maybe they should go someplace else, the more it's likelihood that the larger powers like the United States will see you as a valuable strategic partner, and they're going to bring in the capabilities that actually provide that inherent deterrent to you. But I think the one point which is we all kind of get it, the joke at this point is, the age of security-free riding is over. And if you want to be part of the team, you've got to demonstrate that in your own self-interest, that you care as much about your own security of your own nation as you want your larger partners to care about.
Well, I think, Jim, you made a very good point on that, and I think building on what Tarun just said, one second, Tino, I'll come, because I think what Tarun just said and you emphasized is there has to be a recognition of the dangers when you deal with companies like TikTok, Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, and there's a whole bunch of others, from dumping to hacking to you name it, and there are a number of Russian companies as well as Russian infiltration in a variety of governmental agencies and entities across Europe and in other countries. So how do we deal with that? Tino,
well, now we're getting to some of the really hard issues. I just want to make a comment about Jim's point.
I'm sorry, I was told to give you guys the softball. I made a mistake.
So Jim is right that the way the political conversation is going geopolitically, even alliances are getting another look. And my sense is that the strategic logic of the system of alliances the U.S. has built around the world is very strong. And it's hard to imagine an effective architecture to defend American interests that doesn't heavily rely on critical alliances with South Korea, with Japan, with NATO. That said, you know, this is all getting another look, and there is a perhaps understandable focus on what the dollars and cents are to support that infrastructure. And I'll just note here that the reason this is tricky is not because in principle burden sharing is a good thing. Right. It's that the signals that get sent back and forth about how much is expected, what it really means in practice, how that's supposed to change the structure of the alliance, does end up raising interesting questions probably about how reliable and secure the alliance is. I mean, this is a subset of the larger question of, like, it's hard to know what rhetoric to take seriously when it gets spoken by somebody who's going to have a lot of power. And, you know, the spillover effects end up being partly about nuclear at the end of the day, when you've got countries that are taking seriously this point Jim is making about how do I reliably assure the defense of my people as part of a network of alliances that now is getting a little bit of a second look perhaps. And does that mean I have to rethink my approach to whether I need breakout capability on nuclear weapons? I just note that that's one hard vector here. The other, to Tarun's point, is about how much... A chain
is as strong as its weakest link, and that's the problem.
That's fair, right? And of course, we're not the only ones who can see down the game tree. There was discussion on this very stage earlier about the need to think about the world from the perspective of countries that are dealing with the U.S. on the other side of the equation. But I think to Tarun's point, the high fences, small yards discussion and all the related things around export controls and around thinking hard about the risk to our allies and partner countries of dependence on technological infrastructure from an adversary, to my mind, it just reinforces that we are trying to reconcile two things that are hard to fit together, which is, on the one hand, an approach to technology and security that is harder and more demanding and sees more of the risks of great deal of integration, at the same time the benefits of an economy that's still global and has global supply chains. I just note that at some point, something's going to have to give to some degree, and the balance we're trying to strike right now is important but very unstable to some degree.
Thank you.
Can I jump in for a second?
Quickly, we need to move on.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to say Tino's comments are just so reassuring to me in terms of the theme of this conference, which is about passing the baton and supporting bipartisan foreign policy. I remember at the groundbreaking for USIP, I was a guest of George Shultz, and as a young professor, I thought there's no way this organization can do what it says it's going to do in a town like DC. But when Tino talks about new partnerships and what's evolving in this period, it takes me back to, again, some of the things that Donald Trump campaigned on in 2016 and that are part of the core principles of the Trump doctrine. I think nations are going to join us who are going to try, whether they can live up to all that they should do for their economy and society and security. We're going to see a very creative period in diplomacy. Relationships we didn't think existed or could exist before with the U.S. Are en route.
Thanks, Karen. Let's move on to supply chain. In addition to cybersecurity, the issue that the next administration is going to have to deal with is securing renewable technology supply chains. China's dominance in critical mineral supply chains poses a strategic challenge to the U.S. competitiveness, its allies' competitiveness. How should the U.S. balance its efforts to secure vital resources, including forging international partnerships or potentially other means? So, Tarun, you've been going towards the end. We'll lead off with you this time.
So at the beginning of the administration, we identified 4 critical areas where we thought we had big problems that we needed to try to solve: semiconductors, batteries, critical minerals, and APIs for pharmaceuticals. And so, I would say we've made progress, I think, on 3 of those. Semiconductors, thanks to bipartisan support for the CHIPS Act. We'll have to grade it some years from now to see what really comes online in terms of production and moving away from overconcentration, particularly at the leading edge. And that's become only more important with the acceleration of developments in artificial intelligence right now. I think with the IRA, we're making headway on the batteries and the minerals front, but not fast enough in those. And I don't think we've made as much progress on the API front. That's where we've tried to work with Korea, Japan, the European Commission, and India actually to kind of align our incentives, programs, and our buying power to make more progress. But I think a key challenge that the new team is going to face is China is now lining up its arsenal on critical minerals and other kind of key raw materials. Basically, it's for retaliation purposes, and we've seen this in the context of responding to some of the export controls on semiconductors, semiconductor tooling, but it seems more and more that that's being lined up now to retaliate against potential tariffs as well. Now, in some ways, that may help us accelerate what needs to happen anyway, which is linking arms with our friends, imposing the right trade measures to ensure that nascent efforts to get minerals processing or API production off the ground are not undercut when China immediately drops the price on a lot of that production, which happens not just to us, but talk to our allies in Korea or India as well. It happens to them routinely. So I think a key question, though, on the renewables front is really whether we can agree that even if there's disagreement about climate change, even if there is a difference of views on how much we reinvest in fossil fuel production, that we still have a competition underway in the renewable space, whether we're talking about SMRs for nuclear, whether we're talking about geothermal energy, and that the United States wants to be in a position to provide the most advanced and the best technologies in the world, because those will be the new commanding heights. I hope that's an area where we could come to agreement that that competition will persist and we need to win it.
Tino,
I would add, that was nicely put, Tarun. I would add, let's just assume hypothetically that a policymaker doesn't particularly care about climate qua climate. There are 2 other reasons to care about your question, Ambassador. One is American energy security. At the end of the day, sustainable energy is part of the mix along with other sources of energy. And then the other is ultimately that there is a demand around the world for sustainable energy and energy transition sort of infrastructure, as it were. And if the US is going to be competitive, that means understanding a core challenge, which is the energy supply chain is not one that works if it's just the US or even just the US and its absolutely closest partners like the Mexicos of the world and so on. Anything that is actually going to be competitive globally relative to our toughest adversary is going to require 25 plus countries working together. And I think that will require some mix of thinking hard about what these other countries need and want. In some cases, it'll be mobilizing private investment for their own energy transition. In some cases, it'll be geopolitical. But also recognizing that this effort has to be framed and executed in a way that's going to benefit American workers at the end of the day. So some degree of attention to the domestic side will be necessary to hold together a coalition that is 25, 30, 35 countries strong.
Carnegie, what do you think?
This is one of the key issues, and we saw the supply chain problem front and center during COVID and really constantly since then. And it goes to this larger point about new partnerships. For the U.S., and it relates to, I think, manufacturing and a number of other issues that we've been talking about in the MAGA world for several years. We need reshoring, we need friendshoring, and we need nearshoring. And in a collection of countries, it was just mentioned you need about 25. That means you will need some countries on the African continent who are friendlies, some Central American countries, all working together on all the way from manufacturing to resource issues that are part of our supply chain. And this is just one more reason that we're in a period of really creative diplomacy. Who will be in our space, and our allies will look very, very different by the end of the Trump administration than it looks now, or at any point actually in our history.
So, so you asked the wrong question because they're three separate questions.
I'm prone to do that.
They demand three separate answers. Personally, I think that solar, wind, and EVs are marginal technologies, and I'm not going to invest a lot of things trying to save them because I actually think that this overinvestment in them has actually been to our detriment and to our friends and allies' detriment. You pointed out the rare earths problem is not a supply chain problem. It is a economy problem. It's about commodities. Every time anybody tries to do anything in that space, the Chinese drop the price so much that whatever you want to do, no matter how much you want to subsidize, it becomes literally unaffordable. And so until you break China's OPEC-like control of pricing of commodities, that's a bottomless well. So that's a different problem. It's not about a supply chain. It's about economics. And the pharmaceuticals is a national policy problem. You should not buy things that are strategically essential to you from the one country that wants to destroy you. So you cannot buy pharmaceuticals from China, right? This is an area where there are other people that both can supply and have the capacity to supply it, and there are a whole bunch of sources, whether it's friendshoring, nearshoring, or reshoring, that you can do that. But you just have to say that the days of being strategically dependent on China for a product or service, those days are over. Otherwise, you're never going to fix that one.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm told we're running a little short on time. I just want to ask you each a very quick question, and then I hope we have a chance for questions or no. In your opinion, and we'll start with you first, Kyron, but very quick because we have to go. What is the most important tech issue that's facing our country today?
Asking a professor to go quick is never a good idea, but
cut her mic.
Having a microphone is a very fun thing. It's probably the best that we can do. In terms of our cyber protections, I would say that having, and I'm focusing on the State Department because I serve there, building up cyber diplomacy is really critical. During the Trump administration, we weren't able to get a cyber bureau. The Biden administration did it very, very quickly. But understanding issues around data science, data analysis, computational thinking, infusing that into what our diplomats do will have a huge impact on, I think, our overall security. And in my mind, that means elevating some of the functional bureaus like INR, because issues around cybersecurity are really tied to our understanding of intelligence. So I would say I'd like to see more of this field growing called cyber diplomacy.
I'll be super quick. AI, quantum, life sciences, and space, non-negotiably, you have to be the world's leader.
I would narrow it even more to say I think the key question is how the new team manages the really profound capabilities coming online with AI that I think will drive progress in all of the other fields that Jim mentioned. How we maintain stringent controls on China's access to the leading edge hardware, how we manage the diffusion of the technology so that the world is using American AI, how our national security agencies can make the best use of the technology, and how we can ensure that the leading infrastructure to build it out happens here in the United States.
So Jim mentioned 4, Tarun mentioned 1. I'm going to broaden it to 2, but they're complementary, and I think you're going to see it's the same theme. I've been watching this AI stuff for a while, and I've been really struck by the speed of the increasing capabilities between GPT-4 01 and 03 on math specifically, and very, very advanced math capabilities when you get to being capable in a model of getting results that are akin to what you'd get from a very sophisticated mathematical human thinker, turns into a virtual computer engineer really quickly. So the recursive improvement cycle is not that far off. And to my mind, the question of how we unlock the possibilities, not only for national security, but for human prosperity, well, just keeping the ability to control the technology and to understand how it works effectively as we race to integrate it into our lives, that's pretty profound. And I just think that depends to some degree on this whole amazing system of democracy we have in America working well, being able to bridge political divides, having honest conversations, balancing the speculative with the very hard and fast things we know for sure, and the possibilities with the risks.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Karan. Thank you. Do we have time for a few questions or not? Two?
Okay.
All right, 2 questions. Any? I think we left them speechless.
Oh, there comes that.
There you are.
Hey guys, thank you so much, Ambassador, and such good friends, and the whole team at USIP. It's been a really tremendous day. Just really quickly, and first to Tarun, but to others in the spirit of it. Essentially, if you look at the new AI diffusion rules, there's about 21 good countries, there's about 23 bad countries, and then there's everybody in the middle who is, which includes many partners, and partners or quasi-allies. So for example, what happens with the UAE and India? And I think we're at the point where we think these guys, these other countries, are absolutely critical to succeeding vis-a-vis China. India, stands out, I think, in that regard. But we're also not at the point that they are our closest allies, and so we're going to have more controls than we will with, say, the UK, Australia, et cetera. So I'm just wondering how you see us moving to advance the technology partnerships with the countries that are in that big middle category. And then another India question would be just, where do you think that ISET and the IndusX, the technology cooperation with India, is going to head in the coming few years? Thanks.
Great. So it's a great question, Vikram, because the rule is really designed to enable exactly the kind of cooperation and progressive cooperation that you're talking about. So let's just go to where are we today, right? In many parts of the world, particularly the Middle East and Central Asia, right now you might wait 6 to 9 months or a year to get 64 GPUs, even if a sovereign government's asking, because it gets deadlocked in a licensing process. That's going to change because we now have a larger de minimis of up to something like 1,700 GPUs. That will change, no license required for any of that. We want Commerce to track where those are going because we're worried about China trafficking in those, but that's going to enable a lot of commerce, probably 90+% of the transactions that we see now. Then at the high end, The rule enables any U.S. company that gets that trusted status, which is going to be most of the companies that are planning to build out right now in the countries that you're mentioning and many more, they can put up to 7% of their global compute base in one of those countries. Now, depending on which company we're talking about, that's many hundreds and hundreds of thousands of GPUs, in the 26, 27 timeframe. And every company that has that certification can go do that. And all they need is one certification. They can go out globally and go build out. So that could mean if you're India or if you're the UAE, you can have multiple data centers with millions of GPUs running if you have high conviction and you want to make those investments. And I think down the road, we have set up an architecture where you can sign government-to-government agreements that more closely align our technology protection ecosystems, our AI protection ecosystems. And that to me is one step to thinking about, okay, then does a country belong in another tier of kind of the most trusted countries as well. I think that's, India is a case in point for maybe that's the kind of progress, that's the roadmap that we would like to see. And nothing we're doing now, we believe, is going to inhibit some of the larger build-outs in those countries. You'll have to, of course, ask the new team about how they want to approach kind of what we've done. But our recommendation, of course, is to use the really strong, not just interest of the government, but the public imagination in India and the United States about technology cooperation to leverage even more strategic cooperation across domains. And that's really been the theory of what we've done with the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Tech with India.
Do we have another question out there?
Hi, my name is Ola Mohajir. I work here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Thank you all for your comments. My question is simple. We've talked a lot about how we can use AI for defense capabilities, and I'm wondering if you can tell us what you think if we ask the question about how can we use AI for peace and diplomacy, cooperation, trust-building capabilities.
That's Kyron, I'm going to, again, a quick answer from you. I know it's impossible, but give it a shot.
Great question. And just listening to the previous question, I think they actually relate. During the nuclear era, we quickly came to nuclear norms, no first use of nuclear weapons, limit the number of nations that would have nuclear weapons. We were kind of an anti-nuclear proliferation world. The problem with AI and cybersecurity, especially if you're coming from an America First standpoint, where you're saying put your national interest and national sovereignty first, is that it's going to be difficult to establish cyber and AI norms. And even if you do, how do you enforce them through IOs? This is a big issue, I think. And so the issue of peace and security and societal development is going to be difficult because I think each nation will be approaching it from its own technology standpoint. We just don't have the norms in place yet. And then you have too many non-state actors, which is different than the nuclear era, who can do harm. And if they are protected in a wayport state, that's a real problem.
Thank you, Kyron. You tried. You did a good job. Thank you. Tino, I like the question. It's a great question.
If this technology can boost productivity as much as it promises to, there's more of the pie to share, and that can help achieve agreements. Also, some early experiments indicate that the technology can help bridge divides in terms of getting people at the micro level to understand each other better. That's not to say that if people don't have really strong, powerful interests that are divided about water, about food, that you can bridge it with some digital platform. But at the margin, that can help us. And then finally, the carrot of having access to advanced AI in ways that can really spur development domestically on education or medicine is a powerful way to build a conversation around how an actor like the U.S. can facilitate bargains around the world.
Okay. Yeah, just very quickly, yeah. So AI is going to be used for everything. So I don't want to say it's a dumb question, but the reality, there will be nothing that isn't AI enabled. But how do you be world class? How do you make sure that you are running faster than the other guy being chased by the bear? And it's always going to come down to two fundamental things. The speed and volume that you can process and the access to data that you have to deal with. The person that can do those two things the best, they're going to kick ass on everybody else.
Tarun, you want
No,
to wrap this up? You'll be the last one.
Look, I very much agree with Jim. It's going to be everywhere. We're already, I think, kind of seeing leading U.S. companies, agencies like the National Science Foundation, already kind of working with partners on AI for agriculture, AI for all kinds of development purposes. It's just going to be ubiquitous. And I think the question is, how quickly can we kind of integrate that into our toolkit from a diplomatic perspective? And how can we leverage the amazing work that companies are doing already around the world?
Thank you all very much. All the panelists were absolutely fantastic. We had a great audience.
Good moderator.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.